was willing to sacrifice his life for the betterment of his family back home and for the future of a country that we all love and call home, the United States of America. Madam President, I yield to the senator from California.
President, would it be possible, because Senator Casey and I were each thinking we'd each get 10 minutes, we're willing to cut that time back to 15 minutes between the two? Could we ask unanimous consent if the Republicans don't mind just slipping a little bit because people took extra time?
Is there objection?
Ask that.
Without objection.
Thank you. So we'll each have about 7.5 minutes.
The senator from California.
Madam President, we're going to fix the injustice that my colleague spoke about, injustice to families who lost their loved ones. And let me be clear, one of those 5 who were denied the benefit was someone important to me, a constituent of mine, Army First Lieutenant Jennifer Moreno from San Diego, who was killed this weekend in Afghanistan by a roadside bomb, 25 years old. And because of this shutdown brought to us by the Republicans, those families suffered even more than they're already suffering. Let's be clear, this never had to happen. Never had to happen. This government has been shut down by the Republicans for one reason, and John Boehner was honest about it. He said, and I quote him, "The American people don't want to shut down the government, but the American people don't want Obamacare. They don't want the Affordable Care Act." Well, let me say that to close down the government because you don't like a law that was passed almost 4 years ago, to shut down the government because you lost the presidential election, which was based in large part on this, to shut down the government, to keep our people, millions of them, from getting affordable care for the first time, it's a disgrace. It is. There's no other way to say it, except maybe it was said beautifully here. It was said beautifully here by a chaplain. Enough is enough. Now, we are going to fix this problem. Of course we are. This indignity that our military families had to face. But let's be clear, it never would have happened if the government had been open. Now, we have 2 things that are in our job description, Madam President. I know that you know that quite well. One is to keep the doors of government open efficiently. We do our best. We don't always succeed. There are problems here and there. Keep the doors open. Just like a pilot has to fly a plane. Just like a teacher has to teach a class. Just like a nurse has to give a vaccination. We have a basic responsibility to keep this government open. And we know how to do it. They pass a budget over in the House, we pass it in the Senate, the conference is called, they hammer it out, and we've got a budget plan, and none of this would be happening. And let's be clear, the Republicans have objected now 21 times to Senator Murray, the chairman of our Budget Committee, so she can sit and confer with her counterpart, Paul Ryan, and hammer out the details of a long-term budget. But no, the Republicans don't want to do that. They want to hold the country hostage. They want to put our backs up against the wall, or the backs of the American people. Why? They don't like the health care law. If you don't like a law, you try to repeal it. They tried to repeal it 43 times. It went nowhere. If you don't like a law, try to replace the people who support the law. Oh, they tried. They tried, and they failed. I served with 5 presidents, 3 of them Republicans. I didn't like everything they did, believe me. But after they won, and they had an agenda. I did what I could, and so did my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, to carry it out the best I could, to fix it where I could. Let me just say this. We're in a shutdown because they are throwing a temper tantrum about the health care law, the Affordable Care Act. And I just want to share some news with them, because I went home to see how the health care law is working in my state. And I want to say what I know. I know that it is working. By now, we have had more than 1 million distinct visitors to our site, coveredcalifornia.com. That's coveredca.com. We have tens of thousands of applications. We have completed more than 20,000. Small businesses by the hundreds are coming onto the site. And in the time I have remaining, let me read you about one woman who the Republicans want to stop from getting health care by shutting down the government, okay? According to the Associated Press, nothing could dissuade Rachel Mansfield of La Quinta, who sent in an application for Covered California last week. Rachel's been waiting for the exchange to start so she and her husband can get health insurance. Rachel is self-employed. Her parents currently pay a $530 monthly premium for her coverage. Her husband has been rejected for health coverage because he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Rachel's new premium, instead of it being $530 for just her, will be $400 for both of them, with higher quality coverage than she currently has. That's why the Republicans are having a temper tantrum? To stop my constituent from, for the first time, having peace of mind and having good insurance? Come on! If you don't like the law, work with us. We can make it better. Then there's Melissa Harris, according to the Fresno Bee. She stopped at a Covered California tent on campus. She's paying $600 a month with help from her family for insurance through her former employee. She has detention. And under the Affordable Care Act, which prevents insurance companies from denying coverage for pre-existing conditions, she can now afford health insurance on her own. And the quote from her, from my constituent is, and I quote, "It is a godsend to me, a blessing, a blessing." And that's why the Republicans are shutting down the government, to stop my constituent for getting a blessing of health insurance? There was another story of a man who waited on the phone for 40 minutes and he finally got on. And he signed up and he said, you know what, I've been waiting for years. 40 minutes was nothing. So I say to my friends, the law is the law. Open up the government, pay our bills, and we'll negotiate. And I yield the rest of the time to Senator Casey.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I know our time is limited. I wanted to start with, to start on an issue that all of us, I think, are coming together on, no matter what party we're in, and that's what's been happening to our military families. On Sunday, as noted by the Senator from Kansas a few moments ago, Sergeant Patrick Hawkins from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, was killed in action in Afghanistan when his unit was attacked with an IED, an improvised explosive device. Sergeant Hawkins was moving to the aid of a wounded ranger when he was killed. Due to the shutdown, Sergeant Hawkins' family cannot receive the death benefit provided to soldiers to cover the funeral and burial expenses for that family. Today I'm joining an effort of a number of senators writing to Secretary Hagel to use whatever discretion he has to provide the death benefits to the Hawkins family as well as the other families so they can have and they can meet, we can meet the promise that we made to those families. I know that the President is working on this issue and is working with the Office of Management and Budget and the Defense Department on a solution to this problem. Mr. President, I'll move to the question of where we are now. this is a shutdown brought about by the Tea Party, and we know that if Speaker Boehner would simply hold a vote on the bill that's before him, which would fund the government, this crisis would be over. So we should continue to take steps, number one, to open our government, number two, to pay our bills and make sure we don't miss a bill in default, and number three, to negotiate, or I would argue to continue to negotiate, because we already negotiated a budget number which was much lower than our side of the aisle wanted. We agreed to a number $70 billion less than the other side. If that's not a compromise and a negotiation, I don't know what is. We know that this sentiment and this position to make sure that the government opens is a point of view that's shared by Democrats, Republicans, and independents across the country. 9 members, just by way of example, 9 members of the Pennsylvania congressional delegation, 4 Republicans and 5 Democrats, are supportive of a so-called clean bill that doesn't have attachments to it to open up the government, to make sure that we can have a functioning government, pay our bills, and then work together on longer-term solutions. Just a couple of examples, and I know our time is limited. As this Tea Party shutdown moves into its second week, the Women, Infants, and Children's Program, we know it by the acronym WIC. The WIC program will no longer be able to be funded in many states across the country. We know that this program provides nutritional services to more than 8.9 million participants, including 4.7 million children and 2.1 million infants. 250,000 of my constituents in Pennsylvania depend upon this program. For now, state government is using carryover funds to keep the WIC program running in Pennsylvania. If the government shutdown continues to stretch on, this may put the program in jeopardy. We know the impact that this shutdown is having on older citizens across Pennsylvania and across the country. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services are no longer able to provide health care provider oversight. While Medicare claims are still being paid, the shutdown has caused a reduction in the number of initial surveys and recertifications for Medicare and Medicaid providers. If providers are unable to be certified, then they cannot serve beneficiaries. Home and community-based services are adversely impacted. We know that even though Social Security checks are going out, at the same time, those who are hoping to be enrolled in Social Security don't have that opportunity. Let me read you one line from a letter that we got from a constituent in northeastern Pennsylvania talking about this individual's parents. Based on our, and this is a quotation, besides, I should say, our personal difficulties due to the budget impasse, my elderly parents live with the worry of when and if they will receive their Social Security checks. At 85 and 83, they should not have this uncertainty. These should be their golden years. It breaks my heart to hear my mother saying she can't sleep and has a stomachache from the worry about where our country is headed. Middle and low-income families cannot afford another economic downturn. We are just barely recovering from the last one, unquote. That entire passage came from one individual in northeastern Pennsylvania about her parents. And that's, I think, the best summation that I've read about what this is doing to people. The worry and the anxiety, in addition to the harsh impact, is something that we should not accept. Finally, Mr. President, I'll conclude with some comments about national security. I support, and I know this is widely shared, the passage of the Pay Our Military Act, and welcome the Defense Department's decision to bring a majority of furloughed staff back. We mentioned the death benefits for families. We're all together on that. But all the while that the Speaker doesn't put a bill on the floor that will open the government, we see the impacts on our national security. 70% of the intel community's workforce have been furloughed. These are people that work every day to keep us safe from terrorists, and they're not able to work. The Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control has a skeletal crew, and they're not able to do their work, which is part of our national security. So if we're doing the right thing, and if the Speaker and his party in the House is doing the right thing, they would vote today to open the government, to ensure that we pay our bills, and to continue to negotiate. And it's very simple. What they have in front of them is a 16-page bill. They could pass it this afternoon and reopen our government and give that family in northeastern Pennsylvania some measure of peace of mind instead of the worry and the anxiety and the fear that's caused by both the government shutdown and efforts made to even contemplate defaulting on the full faith and credit of the United States of America. With that, I would yield the floor. And note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Mr. President, I ask that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Last Saturday, the House voted 400 to 1 to express the view that a government shutdown should not interfere with the ability of military chaplains to provide services for our service members. The House took that vote amid reports that chaplains were limited in their ability to minister to those who sought their services, even if ministers were doing so on a volunteer basis. We've heard reports that those who schedule baptisms might not be able to have them. Obviously, this is not a tolerable situation. We've got a very large military presence in Kentucky. The folks at Fort Campbell and Fort Knox really don't need this. We need to remedy the situation immediately and care for the troops that have volunteered to defend us. The House has already taken a stand on an overwhelming bipartisan basis, only one vote against it. It's time for the Senate to do the same. So I would call on the majority to allow a vote to express the Senate's view that service members in my state and every other state or overseas should be able to receive religious services. This is one vote we should have today, and some of my colleagues will talk this afternoon about some of the other votes we should also have. The government may be shut down, but our servicemen and women shouldn't be caught in the middle of this impasse. And I had indicated to my colleague, the Majority Leader, that I would ask consent after my remarks, which I will proceed to do now. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to immediate consideration of H-Con Res. 58, which was received from the House. I further ask consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection? Senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, there's no question when you look across the United States Senate or across the House, people of different political parties, people of different faiths, all support any kind of religious service for members of the armed services. There's no question about that. Our budgets indicate that every year. That's a widely held point of view. Unfortunately, what we're seeing today, though, is a continuation of an effort to pick and choose what areas of our government should be funded. We shouldn't have an exercise where we choose between our soldiers and our kids or between one priority versus the other. We should vote and work together to open the government. It's as simple as that. Open every service that is part of the federal government. Open the government, pay our bills, and continue negotiations that started a long time ago on the current budget. I come from a state which has well more than 1 million veterans. No state in the country has contributed more to the armed services of the United States than Pennsylvania. And I'll take a back seat to no one when it comes to supporting our troops and supporting their families. That's why we're all coming together to make sure that the death benefit is paid for those who recently lost their lives, including Sergeant Hawkins from Pennsylvania. But this process we're going through today is just another attempt to not deal directly with the question of how we're going to operate the federal government. We should urge our colleagues in the House to have a vote today. It would take a matter of minutes for the House of Representatives to vote on a bill that will open up the government, allow us to make sure that we're paying our bills, and do everything we can to continue to work together on a longer-term budget agreement. So I would first, Mr. President, offer a modification to suggest unanimous consent as follows: that an amendment which is at the desk be agreed to expressing the sense of Congress that the House should vote on the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59, the continuing resolution passed by the Senate, that the concurrent resolution as amended be agreed to, that the motions to reconsider be made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Will the Republican leader so modify his request?
Object.
Objections heard. Is there objection to the original request?
I object.
Objection is heard. The Republican whip.
Mr. President, there are obviously differences in this chamber over the fiscal direction of our country, but we should be united in our efforts to do right by our uniformed military and their families, and certainly their survivors. The way they've been treated is simply unacceptable. Indeed, it's outrageous. The President's spokesman today said he's looking for a solution, and we're here to offer one to him. Washington has not gotten a lot right lately, but now's our chance. The legislation I will be offering a unanimous consent on would right this wrong by ensuring that the families of the fallen receive 4 essential benefits: the death gratuity benefit, the coverage of funeral and burial expenses, coverage of travel to both the funeral and the dignified transfer of their loved one's remains, and the temporary continuation of their housing allowance. So, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that when the Senate receives H.J. Res. 91, making continuing appropriations for survivor benefits for survivors of deceased military service members for fiscal year 2014, that the measure be read 3 times and passed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection? The majority leader.
I'd like to object. Would my friend agree that we've just learned that the President said he would solve this in the next hour? Would my friend be willing to wait till, say, 4 o'clock today and renew your request at that time if it hasn't been done?
Mr. President, responding to the distinguished majority leader, if that will help facilitate this getting done, we'd be glad to work with you. Hopefully we can again find another area like we did for military pay for our uniformed military where we can begin to mitigate the hardship caused by this shutdown.
I think on this issue, the best way to proceed, that we can do something together, and hopefully the White House will be in on what we're trying to do. So I asked my friend to renew this at 4 o'clock, or, yeah, that's right, 4 o'clock, or have some other.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Wyoming.
Mr. President, if businesses ran their operation the same way that the government is running this shutdown, they'd be bankrupt. Oh, that's right. That's kind of where we are, isn't it? Our national parks, particularly the ones that are revenue producers, are shut down. Yellowstone Park is a revenue producer. You pay to go into the park. You pay to travel through the park. The roads connect up Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And it's a thoroughfare. And you have to pay to be able to do that. But right now you can't do that, which means you probably have to travel an extra 300 miles to get to your destination. And the park doesn't get the revenue. Not only that, there are people in the park that are visiting there, and they've been made to leave. Now, they were made to leave in a very ungracious way. One of the tours was from Japan, Australia, Canada, and some people from the United States. And they had reservations at Old Faithful, That's one of the really historic places in the park, one place that everybody goes because they like to see the geyser go off. It's probably the most famous geyser in the whole world. But they were told they had to leave. They had 2 days reservation, so they said, okay, you can stay for the 2 days. But an armed guard was outside of their room, and they couldn't leave their room. Not to go watch the geyser go off, which they don't have any control over, nor can they harm. But they had, so it's been written up as Gestapo tactics that met senior citizens in Yellowstone Park. So we're giving up the revenue and we're creating a bad impression. We shouldn't be doing that. We ought to be taking the revenue. And the revenue is a little more difficult than that because we have concessionaires in the park, people that run the hotels and the stores and the filling stations and the other services that are in there, and they pay a fee for doing that and a percentage of what they take in. And so we're not getting that percentage now either. And they're losing about $4 9/10 million a week by not being able to be open. There are a lot of other things I could say about the way that the parks are being treated here and around the country, but the ones that are revenue producing are particularly egregious. So I would ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 203, HJ Res 70, making continuing appropriations for National Park Service operations. I ask further consent that the measure be read 3 times and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from California.
I appreciate the emotion of my colleague. As someone who comes from a state where tourism is the number 3, and we have 38 million people, it's the number 3 business in our state. We have national parks. But guess what? You fellas over there, you didn't take care of all my recreation land under the Army Corps. You didn't take care of all the BLM land. This whole notion of funding the government piecemeal is absurd. This is the greatest nation on earth, and all you can do is come here with these little mini piecemeal bills. Let's face it, we wouldn't be going through any of this angst, and my friend wouldn't have to have any of that emotion if the Republicans had not shut down the government. So let me tell you in the rest of my reservation, we certainly support the notion that our parks should open. But we also support the notion that this government should open. And if people over there don't like certain functions, let's duke it out here and find out which you have the votes to do away with. I know a lot of you don't like the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. Fine. Let's fight that out. I see my colleague is here from Wyoming. He and I, we're constantly debating the issue of what should be a priority, but you don't do it this way. We need the entire federal government open. People need to get paid. The communities around the parks, around the BLM land, around the core recreational land, around our NASA Ames facility, and I could go on, need to be paid because the mom and pop shops are suffering. You don't do government by piecemeal, not in the greatest nation on earth. You know what it reminds me of? A woman is drowning, and somebody goes to rescue her, but he only takes her halfway to the shore and leaves her to drown. That's what this is about. You don't say, I'll save this child over here, but this one I don't have to save. I'll save this community over here because I kind of like it. But this community, sorry. No one party has a right to do it. Not the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party. We don't have the right to decide which kids live and which kids die, and which families thrive and which sink, and which communities suffer and which communities don't. None should suffer, not in this nation. Open the government, pay our bills, and let's negotiate. Let's negotiate on everything. So, I have a modification to suggest to the unanimous consent request, and this is it, if I might. I ask consent the request be modified as follows: that an amendment which is at the desk be agreed to, that the joint resolution as amended then be read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. This amendment is the text that passed the Senate. It is a clean, continuing resolution for the entire government, and it is something that is already over in the House and reportedly has the support of the majority of the members of the House of Representatives.
Mr. President.
Will the senator from Wyoming so modify his request?
Reserving the right to object. The reason we're in this mess right now is because we didn't do the budgets piecemeal. We're supposed to do them piecemeal. We're supposed to do 12 separate spending bills. We're supposed to do them one at a time. We're supposed to have the right to amend them. That way we can get into the details on what we're spending instead of an omnibus bill, which is what's being suggested by this amendment. Had we gone through each of those, we could have had all these discussions, and that's how we should do it. And that's our second most important task. Our most important one, of course, is the defense of our country. But the second most important one is the spending bills. And we're not doing the spending bills. Now, I know the other side will say, well, we brought up one, and it was filibustered, and we didn't get cloture on it. We just did that one time. There should have been every one of these bills brought up with the right to amend, and then they wouldn't have been filibustered. And then they could have been passed when the House sent their companion bill. So since we didn't do the process right, we're stuck with a continuing resolution, and piecemeal is one way we can get it through. There was a request for a conference between the two sides. That was turned down by the Democrats. That would have been a chance to resolve all of these things at once. That was turned down, so I object to the modification.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Is there objection to the original request?
Mr. President, just reserving the right to object to the original request, I feel I must respond. Senator Murray and I just looked at each other and said, we feel like it's Alice in Wonderland here. Where was my colleague the 20 times, or more, 21 to be exact, 21 times when the chairman of the Budget Committee or her representative asked to go to conference on the budget resolution in which the conferees would negotiate for how to fund the various parts of government, and that instruction would be sent to the appropriators. I do not understand what is happening here. All we hear on the other side is negotiate, negotiate, and they won't remember, selective memory maybe, that they objected 21 times to going to negotiations on the budget. So I have to say, this is the saddest display coming from the Republicans who serve in the greatest legislative body in the world to try and fund this government on a piecemeal basis, leaving some of our families winners, some of our families losers. It is pathetic. And they have caused this Republican shutdown, and they can end it. And because I feel my friends' narrow, piecemeal approach to running this country is really wrong for this country, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
The senator from Iowa.
I ask, does the senator from Wyoming still have the floor?
Yes.
The senator from Wyoming has the floor.
Mr. President, I ask if the senator from Wyoming would yield for a question.
I would.
Mr. President, I asked my friend from Wyoming, mentioned the fact that we should bring up appropriations bills, and as someone who's been a member of the Appropriations Committee for quite a long time, I would just remind my friend from Wyoming that earlier this year, on the first appropriations bill that we passed out of committee under the leadership of Senator Mikulski, was the Transportation, Housing, Urban Development Bill. If I'm not mistaken, it had a number of Republican votes in committee. It was brought out onto the floor, an extraneous amendment was offered on Egypt by the senator from Kentucky, whereupon I believe Senator Mikulski, or our leader, filed cloture on the bill so we could vote on the appropriations bill. But, Mr. President, I say to my friend from Wyoming that all of the Republicans on that side voted against cloture, voted against taking up that one appropriations bill. I'm sorry, I'm reminded that we had one Republican, the Republican from the state of Maine, who did vote to go to cloture on that bill. So one Republican out of all those on the other side. So I say to my friend from Wyoming, we tried to bring up an appropriations bill. It was Republicans who objected to even dealing with that appropriations bill. I thank my friend from Wyoming for... And I just asked my friend from Wyoming if he had looked at that history and understood what had happened on that bill that came up at that time.
The senator from Wyoming.
I've looked at both of the histories that have been discussed here. One of them is the budget one. The failure of the budget to not have a conference committee did not stop the Appropriations Committee from going through and doing 12 appropriations bills. I think that's what I count here on the calendar that could have been brought up. There was only the one brought up, and you've said appropriately that in committee there got to be some amendments. On the floor there were none. What we spent a lot of time around this body doing this year is trying to negotiate how few amendments could be brought up, and that's taken longer than it would have taken to go ahead and vote on the whole issue. I object and yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
for the benefit of those on the other side of the aisle, I'm not going to end my remarks with the issue of unanimous consent, but I still have things I want to say. No one supports a government shutdown, not my side of the aisle or the other side of the aisle. Could we have avoided the situation? Sure. The government could be open and fully operating today, but for the majority unwillingness to engage in a legitimate debate over proposals to amend Obamacare or any other issues that have come before us, and not even having a debate on those pieces that have come over from the other body, because hiding behind a motion to table is a way of avoiding debate. So, as we know, the House passed and the Senate defeated 3 different continuing resolutions. Each one of those would have kept the government open and prevented a shutdown, but they were rejected by the Senate majority. We are where we are because the majority refused to give the American people relief from the individual mandate and treat President Obama and his political appointees the same as all other Americans, or as we now in Congress will be treated when it comes to health insurance. We could have considered each of the 12 individual appropriation bills, passed them into law, but the Senate Democratic leadership has been derelict in that responsibility. The Senate did not get into debate on a single one of those bills prior to the end of the fiscal year. And I heard just now what my colleague from Iowa said, that one was brought up and then amendments were filed and there wasn't a motion to move ahead. The point being that the Senate is a deliberative body. Every senator's got a right to offer an amendment. We were denied that right by the majority, or at least wasn't assured of that right by the majority, and that's why cloture was not granted. And of course, what the American people deserve is fair consideration of all the money that we appropriate. But you don't get that consideration on a continuing resolution. You get it all lumped into one piece of legislation. We should be, as a senator from Wyoming said, considering separate appropriation bills. I remember not too long ago that a Senate majority or a chairman of an appropriation committee on the other side of the aisle, so that's when they were in the majority, was bragging to the United States Senate that for the first time in a long time, the Senate passed every appropriation bill before the end of the fiscal year. If it could be done then, why can't it be done now? But it isn't going to be done if you aren't willing to debate the bills. So it seems to me that the American people, the taxpayers, deserve a thoughtful and good faith effort to find common ground on our spending matters. It's a duty to pass spending bills. Passing a continuing resolution has become a new normal around here, and that's not right. It's not acceptable. While we wait for the Senate majority and the President of the United States to come to the negotiating table and end their government shutdown, we should be working to fund or reopen areas of government where there is agreement. That's what we did when we passed the Pay Our Military Act, where we all agreed to pay those both in and out of uniform who defend our freedom. We made a commitment to them because their commitment to our country. The military people deserve that piece of legislation. That's what we should be doing to open our national parks and monuments. That's what we should do to ensure the critically important work at the National Institute of Health. Why hold these widely supported and critically necessary areas hostage? Why is the majority insisting on an all-or-nothing approach? Why can't we agree to fund these things that we agree on and negotiate the rest? And at the very least, a little bit of common sense ought to prevail. Common sense, for instance, when the minority leader made the point about chaplains. It's common sense that chaplains have an obedience not just to the government but to a higher authority, and they ought to be able to exercise that wherever they are. We have a situation that the parks aren't open. We have a situation where the World War II memorial was closed down. Open-air memorials have never been closed down when we had shutdowns in the past. And just a little bit of common sense prevailing would avoid a lot of these situations that we are bringing before the Senate for consideration. But remember, the House of Representatives has passed legislation to keep the government open, and the Senate has refused it. I yield the floor.
I'd like to have him use the shorthand. And
Mr. President.
The senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, have an interesting debate going on here, and without achieving any results, let me give a crack at trying to make a more persuasive argument, see if my colleagues across the aisle would agree. We can disagree on what is an essential function of government, what's a constitutional function, what we ought to be funding and not funding. I mean, that's some of the debate that we're in here today. But I don't think anyone can disagree that an essential function of government is providing for our national defense, is providing for homeland security, protecting Americans from terrorist threats, and responding to natural disasters. And there's an organization, a government, called the Federal Emergency Management Agency. FEMA is the common name. FEMA is there to provide support to first responders whenever a natural disaster hits, whenever an intended disaster through an act of terrorism hits this country or threatens Americans. These are functions that have to be immediately responded to. And FEMA has, over the years, improved significantly its ability to play a crucial role in responding to these types of efforts that put Americans at risk. And so what I'm bringing forward here, because we now know that while some functions of FEMA are being supported and funded and manned, many have been furloughed. Many who would be essential should a disaster hit, whether it's natural or man-made, are furloughed and not available to assist in that first response. And so I'm simply asking that we consider seriously and gain the support for funding of FEMA to its full extent. We have recently seen natural disasters in the United States. We had tornadoes roar through southern Indiana. FEMA was there just last year. FEMA was there immediately. We're still in hurricane season, and while we've been very fortunate this year that we have not had a major hurricane land on continental United States, Karen was in the Gulf, it dissipated. I might remind my colleagues hurricane season runs all the way to November 30th, so we're not out of the woods yet. We've just seen a disaster in the upper Midwest with an unprecedented amount of snow falling, affecting ranchers, affecting communities, are some of our northern states, South Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, and others. We've seen massive flooding and wildfires throughout the West. Now, all of these are disasters that need to be responded to, and FEMA plays a major role in all of that. And who knows what potential terrorist attacks or threats are out there where we may need to have an immediate response. So what I'm asking here is that we consider funding of FEMA at its current annual funding rate of $10.2 billion. This bill will extend funding for FEMA until December 15. But funding in the bill could end sooner if Congress hopefully reaches a larger budget agreement before that time. Hurricane season doesn't end until November 30th, as I've said. We can ensure that this critical government function is not in any way limited by passing this bill, which was supported by 23 Democrats in the House of Representatives. So it does have bipartisan support. I therefore ask, Mr. President, unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 210, House Joint Resolution 85, making continuing appropriations for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and I ask further consent that the measure be read 3 times and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered and made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
The Assistant Majority Leader.
reserving the right to object, I want to commend my colleague from Indiana for noting the important role that the federal government plays when it comes to natural disasters. There's not a senator on this floor who hasn't seen this federal response in his own home state because of a natural disaster. And the senator from Indiana is proposing that we respond to these natural disasters with the government agencies that have been authorized and appropriated, usually appropriated, the funds to do so. He has picked one of them, FEMA, and he's picked it because of the possibility of a hurricane. That's a legitimate observation. Unfortunately, the senator from Indiana is not telling the whole story. FEMA plays an important role. Wouldn't you like to have the Weather Service fully funded so we could see the hurricane coming in advance? Sadly, it is a casualty of the Republican shutdown. Wouldn't you like to have the Coast Guard available to have aerial observation of the oncoming hurricane and to provide that information to save lives? Sadly, it's not included in your unanimous consent request, and many of their functions are the victims of the Republican government shutdown. I'm sorry, too, that when it comes to the actual damage done by a disaster, FEMA plays an important role, but not an exclusive role. And you know this from Indiana, as I do from Illinois. Listen to the other agencies that are a critical part of responding to natural disasters. The Small Business Administration, you know they're usually the first on the scene with the Red Cross. Sadly, they're closed down because of the Republican shutdown of the government, and you don't include them in your natural disaster request. DOT, Department of Transportation, the need for emergency highways in the midst of hurricanes and tornadoes, not included in the senator from Indiana's request. The Corps of Engineers, the National Guard and Reserve, the Public Health Service, none of these are included. But the good news is, from the senator from Indiana, we can take care of this together. I'm going to suggest a modest modification of your request that covers all of the disaster agencies of the federal government that respond and keep us safe and do everything to put families back in their homes and businesses back in business. It is just a basic idea. Let's reopen the federal government. I ask consent that the request of the senator from Indiana be modified, that amendment which is at the desk be agreed to, that the joint resolution as amended then be read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. This amendment is the text that passed the Senate. It is a clean, no strings attached, continuing resolution for the entire government and every disaster agency of the federal government, and is something that is already in the House of Representatives and has reportedly the support of a majority of the members of the House of Representatives. I hope the senator from Indiana will stick with me. Let's get the job done and accept this modification.
Mr. President.
Will the senator from Indiana so modify his request?
Reserving the right to object, Mr. President, I think my colleague from Illinois, the senator from Illinois, has made an important point. There are agencies that relate to the role that FEMA plays when a natural disaster or homeland security is threatened. And I therefore, I don't disagree with that. And so I therefore would be willing to modify my amendment to include the Coast Guard, the Weather Service, and those agencies listed by the senator from Illinois as part of this. So directing this toward applying to natural disasters and threats to our homeland security, I think should include those agencies. And so if we could go forward with that request, I don't think that's what the senator offered. He offered a total CR here, which we know is not going to go forward under the current circumstances, even though all of us want to get to that point. But as was discussed earlier by my colleagues, the regular order here is usually to take appropriations, pieces of appropriations, and pass them on an individual basis. And that simply is what we're doing here, given the constraints that we have that prevent us from doing that and coming forward. I would say this, the House has sent over 3 times opportunities to take up the full CR that had been rejected by the other side, and a 4th opportunity to sit down and negotiate how we would go forward, which has also been rejected. So it works both ways. So if the senator would be able to acknowledge the addition of what was listed directly related in his statement, then we could give that consideration here.